An important question you're going to have to ask yourself as a TA is how to measure student success. And when measuring student success, that's where evaluation comes in. When you're evaluating students, you're measuring their learning. Traditionally, when measuring learning, this is the image that comes to mind. Row after row after row of students sitting there taking exams 3 hours at a time while an invigilator just walks along the path. Though this is one measurement technique, it does have its drawbacks and it may not measure everything you're looking for. As a new TA, you're probably going to be asking yourself, what can I do as a TA to improve assessment? It's a good question. What you can do requires you to look at what the purpose of assessment is. One goal of assessment is to figure out where your students are along the learning path. How far are they along in the course? What are the goals the course is trying to get at? And how do they measure up along that path? Another purpose of assessment is to let students know what they've learned and what they need to work on. And a third goal is conveying to outside people that your students have met certain standards. And try to remember that the outcome of an assessment doesn't just measure how well your student learns, but also how well you, as the instructor, teach. And also, very importantly, whether the technique you've used to evaluate students is actually appropriate for what you're trying to do. With that background, let's go back to gauging where students are along the learning path. What you're going to have to do is you have to set out the path. Where is it that you want students to go? Knowing what the garden path leads to needs the bullseye at the end, both at the end of the lesson as then at the end of the course, through clear learning objectives, also better known as the thing you measure with a summative assessment, whether the student has actually reached those goals. That's the goal of summative assessments. But there's also another assessment goal, and they're called formative assessments, and that is allowing students to know where they are along those paths. So there's little markers here. So they can say, hey, I've achieved this, I know what I'm doing, or hey, I need to work on that. Now you may ask yourself, me as a lowly servant, being the TA, being the middleman between the students and the instructor, what can I do? Is there anything I can do? The answer is, there's lots you can do to improve assessment. There are ways you can work with the instructor and ways you can work with the students. So what is it you can do with the instructor? You can help the instructor work on improving 1. Reliability, and 2. The validity of the assessment techniques used. Reliability looks at consistency, and the second part of reliability is reproducibility. So you're looking at, will this technique give the same result in the same mark, whether it's me marking it as the TA across time, at different times, or will it give the same mark and the same result if there are different TAs or different instructors marking the same exam? There are 2 things you can do to help your instructor and help your students increase reliability. The first is setting out clear, measurable objectives. And the second is using rubrics that actually reflect those clear, measurable objectives that you've helped set with the instructor, and of course you've communicated with your students. And there are ways you can help your instructor improve the validity of assessments. And that's using methods that actually measure what you're after. For example, you wouldn't figure out how hot it is, or you wouldn't measure the temperature of a room by using a level. A level is not going to give you the temperature of a room. A thermometer will. So it's important to use the right methods. And it's not just the right methods in the summative sense, but also the right methods for formative assessments. So how can you communicate to your students where they need to be, and if they've gotten where they are supposed to be? And what can you do with students? Well, first, tell them what the objectives are. What are the learning outcomes for the class, for the course? The second is sharing with them how you'll measure their progress towards their objectives or their mastery of those objectives. So if spelling matters, let them know spelling matters. If part of the lesson is making sure they know how to use a certain citation format, make sure that's communicate to them. That's part of the objectives, and you will measure it by comparing their citations against the standard used. And the third is be useful. And what I mean by that is if you're going to write notes in the margins of a paper, write it legibly so the student can read it. And you know what? Provide comments that are both constructively critical, but also positive and encouraging. And maybe at the end, provide a little summary of this is what you've done right, this is where you can improve, and maybe some resources of where the student can improve. Now I realize this may seem like a tall order for a TA, but I think in the end, working with the instructor to improve assessment and communicating that assessment and working with the students so that they understand the assessment and can use the assessment will make your teaching experience a lot more rich, both for you and your students. And finally, you have to remember that York University or even your own faculty may have its own approach, not just to assessing students, but also how that assessment is reflected in marks. York has descriptions of marks. So for example, an A plus has a certain description. So you have to make sure that your measurement technique and your objectives are expressed in a way so that you can match the performance of the students, your assessment of that performance, to those descriptions. So it might be worthwhile to read those descriptions as well. Thanks a lot.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.